Welcome back. We're looking at the candid views of Muslims around the world following the biggest poll of its kind. Joining me are Dr. John Esposito and Dalia Mogahed, the co-authors of Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. Now, just before the break, we were talking about this idea of how you might change perceptions. And actually, I have an email I'd like to put to you, Dalia, if I may. It's from Oman. And Khalid Al-Haribi says, it's sad that it takes a foreign think tank to discover what Muslims think, while Muslim thinkers have been trying for years to tell the world. Why do Muslims always have to explain and defend themselves? Any comment?
I think it's a very important question. What we really want to make sure we explain is that Gallup, as an American company, is not speaking for Muslims. We are simply a mechanism by which Muslims are speaking for themselves. What we did is we went out and, in a very neutral and scientific way, asked Muslims around the world what they thought and are telling the world what we heard.
Let's get a caller on the line from the UAE. Osman, it's good to hear from you. What would you like to ask?
Yes, these cartoons in Denmark, as well as the whole thing in this Dutch politician. I'm not sure if he's a politician or he's a filmmaker.
Right.
This film about fitna.
That's right.
And I had a chance to look at it, and for me, there's more politics behind it, sort of creating more problems.
Osman, let me put it, that's an interesting point. Let me put that to the professor and ask, in trying to find the way forward and trying to find solutions to this, how do we depoliticize the debate on Islam?
Well, I think that we have to begin to, in order to depoliticize it, that in fact one needs to be more aware of what the realities are. See, and I think this is why this poll data is so important. From my point of view, part of the problem our policymakers have is that they really are not aware of who they're dealing with. Michael Schur, who was the CIA chief of station for the Bin Laden project, recently wrote a review of the book that said something like, this is the one book that needs to be read before it's too late. And part of what his argument, was that that's not been the case, and one worries whether or not we'll ever make it around the corner.
But when you look at the situation that Osman brought up, which was the cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad and this new fitna movie that's been done, how do you, as someone who understands the religion, who sees it from the inside and the outside in some ways, how do you balance freedom of speech and the right to express and being sensitive to religion?
Well, I think that one has to be one has to start with the fact that societies, however much we believe in freedom of speech, and I certainly do believe that freedom of speech pertains to everybody, along with respect. And a number of countries outlaw or simply will not allow certain kinds of speech. For example, there are countries where to do a cartoon on the Holocaust would be seen as not acceptable. But part of the problem we have with highly secular societies, let alone societies where you have a kind of strong political right that is anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim, is that it's almost as if they will say that it's perfectly legitimate to ban something that deals with, let's say, animal rights, if they're concerned about animal rights, but they don't understand why people get upset about blasphemy. And I think that what our book shows is that majorities of Muslims, both moderate and politically radicalized, believe and resent that Islam and Muslims are being denigrated. Therefore, when something like the Danish cartoons happen, naturally there's an explosion. But that contrasts with the way in which, for example, the Dutch have been handling this fitna situation, because this has been handled behind the scenes for several months. The Dutch have been very sensitive. And they're in that tough spot that we all are of saying, look, we affirm free speech, but free speech ought to be respect for everyone. And I think that that's what's got to be emphasized.
Dalia, if I could ask you, the word or the expression Muslim world is used a lot. Now, when you make it clear in the book that the Muslim world is very diverse geographically and culturally, so is there really any such thing as a cohesive, tangible Muslim world?
Well, there really isn't a set monolithic group, of course, or a defined Muslim world. It's really it's a term that really means the global Muslim community, Muslims everywhere that do share a common identity but have multiple identities, including Western identities.
Is there danger in creating this monolithic bloc which can then be targeted by using that term then?
Well, we can definitely discuss if the word is the right one to use, Muslim world, but we can't deny that what happens in one place affects other people that are Muslim, even if they're not directly affected. So, for example, we saw Indonesians' opinion of the United States dramatically affected by the Iraq War. Well, the only thing they have in common is that they're Muslim. So there is a common identity that we have to understand. That's not the same as saying that they're all part of one monolithic whole.
Analogously, it's a little bit like the West in the sense that, outsiders like to talk about the Christian West. Right. Well, the fact is, even when Christianity was a kind of substrate for everybody, the differences between French and German, 2 world wars, and between the attitudes of Europeans towards America and vice versa, sort of historically and culturally, remarkably different. And yet there is a kind of commonality, there are a common base.
In the term the West, which ties in there. We've got Mohammed on the line from Dubai. What would you like to ask?
Hi, good evening.
Good evening, go ahead.
There was a lot of talk on the whole sort of relationship between East and West, and my question really revolves around more of a North-South relationship, in which obviously, as we know, commonly it's referred to that 15% or 10% of the world is ruling the rest. Yeah. And so whether the poll takes that into consideration, because I think that that's an equally important issue to be discussed.
Thanks, Mohammed. That's a great question. I'll ask Dalia maybe to address that.
Well, I think we definitely look at that because this poll is actually a subsection of a much wider poll. We poll in 140 countries covering 95% of the world's population. So we look at the differences between the rich and the poor. We look at really Muslims in a global context, not just them by themselves under a microscope.
Right. We have on the line from New Zealand, great to hear from New Zealand, John. John, what would you like to ask?
Hi, good morning. At least it's good morning here.
Good morning to you.
I'm just wondering, why is it that I feel I'm saddened by the fact that Islamic people, Muslim people, seem to be so much on the defensive with regards to violence, for example. I mean, in the last several hundred years, 99 or 95 or 99% of people killed in warfare and violence seems to be at the hands of Christians and Christians fighting Christians. And as we talk, I'm sure that most people being killed in the world are actually being killed by so-called Christians. This never seems to be sort of noticed.
John, I'd like to put that to our professor here, Professor John Esposito, maybe answer this question about the perceptions of Islam with violence. And of course, you mentioned in the book there's a whole section on jihad and misunderstanding of the word jihad.
I think that one of the realities that I say to people, and it's true, is that I have the best job in the world because for 30 years people ask me the same questions, and that includes policymakers. Now you have to ask, where's our learning curve? Do we still raise the same questions about Jews and Christians? And I think that part of the difficulty is, again, I believe because of the polarization of experts. See, I think that's part of the problem. It's not just that you have people that don't know. You have people that know and have an agenda. And what that does then is that it promotes this notion of that Islam is a peculiarly violent religion. One of the things I do with my students is I send them an email with excerpts from the Bible and excerpts from the Quran that deal with fighting and violence out of context. And I ask them, read these excerpts out of context, and what would you conclude about these religions? And it's rather shocking, But I will have, for example, an audience where I'll have devout Christians will get up and talk about passages of the Quran, which they pull out of context, and then I will read back to them passages in the Bible, and they don't know how to answer you.
Right, the sword chapters you're referring to.
Yeah.
I thought, to wrap this up, Dalia, has the poll been done in such a way that there is a natural follow-up, that you can look at how perhaps ideas and perceptions and misconceptions might change down the road? Have you set it up in such that you can always look back on not rather than just conducting a fresh poll, follow up with the same sort of people perhaps, see if the ideas have changed?
Well, the way we've done it is we get a snapshot of what that entire country believes over time. And it is going to be a longitudinal study. We'll continue to do what we've committed for 100 years. So we will see how things change as we move forward.
And if you were just to sum up, what would be the next step in terms of perhaps working on the results of this book to improve the relationship between Muslims and the rest of the world?
I think really our call to action is to read the book and allow Muslims to speak for themselves instead of letting extremists speak for them.
Well, I thank you both for coming along and talking to us about this. Thank you very much, Dalia and Professor. Good to speak with you again.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. On tomorrow's show, we mark World Autism Awareness Day by looking at the developmental disorder that appears to be striking children in epidemic proportions. Send in your questions and thoughts. We'll see you next time.